You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans, the founder of War on the Rocks. This is a special episode meant to mark our 10th anniversary. July is our 10th anniversary month. We launched in July 2013. And in this episode, I asked a very good friend of mine, Philip Zelikow, to sit down and interview me and turn the mic back on me because I knew he would make me dig deeper. Philip is well known for many reasons. He's a former diplomat, academic, and author. He was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. He was the counselor to the Secretary of State during the Bush administration. He's an author of so many fascinating works, including most recently a multi-author study on what went wrong during the COVID-19 epidemic. But, on subjects as diverse as World War I to the Philippines to the pandemic, it's remarkable. And I'm very grateful that Philip agreed to sit down and interview me on this auspicious occasion. So I hope you enjoy the show.
So War on the Rocks is now celebrating its 10th anniversary and has a wide readership. But before someone invented something called War on the Rocks, it would have been very hard to imagine that there could be such a thing with such a name. What mad brainstorm occurred 10 plus years ago?
So I had gotten back from working in Afghanistan as a civil servant, and I was bored by what a lot of other people were writing these days at that time, and this was in 2012, 2013, on matters of war and peace. This was in the middle of the clickbait revolution online, where a lot of money was going to online advertising. So even niche foreign policy and defense publications went from publishing 50 articles a month to almost 600 articles a month in some cases. And people like me, the sort of up-and-coming national security nerds and wonks and professionals, I think felt left behind. We weren't learning as much from online sources as we used to. At the same time, I was having these great conversations with friends and mentors who had been in government, who had been in the armed services, who had been doing important work in the academy. Most of these conversations were over drinks, and I thought it'd be nice to recenter these voices for a public audience. And there was actually a podcast that I started in 2012 before we launched the site, but I don't know where those episodes even are. I'm not even sure how we distributed them, to be honest. I don't remember. But as for the name, I wanted something that captured that these were conversations over drinks, but of course about a weighty subject, war, the weightiest subject. But booze and war felt a bit too irreverent. So I was in London, and I was visiting with my friend Raymond Asfour, who I had worked with in Helmand. He's a British civil servant there. And we were walking through Piccadilly Circus, and he actually came up with the name on the spot, War on the Rocks. And I'm like, that's it. And I said, thank you, Ray. I will pay you nothing for this. I'm just taking it. And I did. And then in the summer of 2013, we launched it as a formal site, relaunched the podcast, and that's how it got going.
Come back a little further. So there are lots of people who've had experience in the wars, both uniform and civil servants. Not all of them decide to start podcasts and think that they need to get into the business of public education, public analysis, and so forth. So why you?
It's a great question. I think part of it is I've never been a joiner. I've always felt if I'm going to do something, I should create it. And it's something I didn't understand about myself at the time, but I've learned that more about myself since. But I was also inspired by people who had come before me. So Andrew Exum's blog, Abu Mukawama, which was very popular at that time. Small Wars Journal, of course, was a big inspiration. And so I viewed this as taking the next step, as sort of taking that, professionalizing it, having a staff, having a team, having regular contributors, making it so I was actually not the central voice, which is not to say it's bad to have someone who's the central voice, but that's just not how I wanted to do it.
Let me take you back a little further. Why were you so interested in performing an educational mission at all? Not everyone wants to get into the business of, providing analytical products for the world, either online or in any form.
The phenomenon that I talked about before, about the sort of clickbaitiness of foreign policy and defense outlets at that time, really had a harmful effect, I would say, on our understanding of what was happening in the wars that we were still involved in, but on all sorts of other foreign policy issues. So I felt that the conversation had just become less serious, and that was to the poverty of our debate and our policy making. People who had sort of been there on the ground, involved in these issues, these voices were being systematically devalued due to these sort of commercial trends in the media business. And I really felt it was important to feature the voices of people who had the relevant experience to inform policymaking. And I thought it was, as an ethical matter, extremely important.
So what I'm hearing is one of the many people who are coming out of the wars with simmering frustration and even anger about the quality of discussion about what's going on. And you decide, like, I'm so bothered about this, and I'm going to try to do something about it. And I'm going to try to, as you put it, get these voices heard. And that you thought you actually had ideas about how it could be done. Maybe you thought you paid attention to the way the media world had evolved a little bit. And so you felt you could channel that frustration and anger in this way.
Yeah, there was definitely some frustration and anger, particularly coming back from Afghanistan and then seeing what's being written about it. And it almost feels like they're writing about a completely different place, building these narratives that just aren't true or are built on bad assumptions or not covering the truly important things that were going on. But this was not just about Afghanistan. This was about a host of issues, and Afghanistan was just one of those indicators. But there was definitely some frustration, and I think that's right. And I think that we have a tendency in our popular culture and society and in the media business, and now it's well entrenched, to treat things frivolously. And I thought that was very wrong when it came to matters of war and peace. It's not something that should ever be given the listicle treatment or treated frivolously. It's something that should be, it's not to say you can't joke around and have fun, but you gotta, at the end of the day, return to the fact that this is about people living and dying. And this is about protecting our society, and you have to treat these things seriously.
So I want to notice the contrast. You have the title of the online publication you created, War on the Rocks, which to some people seems frivolous. But in a way, it seems to me that you're almost using the frivolity as a kind of mask for the depth of the seriousness and even anger that's underneath it, which you put a jocular label on it. But the impulse behind it is serious and perhaps even at times a little bit bitter.
Yeah, and I think that the name, it's double entendre, of course, is, the one version is the war and disenchantment. We are on the rocks strategically. And the other is these are conversations over drinks. And I think that there is a frivolity to that, of course, but it's also about creating a community. It's also about creating an intimate conversation. One of the best compliments I got about the podcast was, I feel like I'm at a bar in DC eavesdropping on a conversation. And, what's more intimate and community building than pulling up a chair next to someone at a bar and having a conversation? And so and there's a lot of people out there who wanted to be a part of that conversation. And they weren't necessarily famous or big names. We've certainly had big names in the publication, but some of the most interesting names are the people that our readers had probably never heard of before, the majors and captains who had just gotten back from the wars, for example.
That's a really interesting point. It's worth a little bit of reflection. The war's been going on for a long time. A lot of people have gone through these, and I'm really quite struck at the voices of the lower level field grade officers who've kind of really been out there and feel that people don't really understand what's going on, that we've been doing this now for years and years, and thousands of people are cycling through this, and the country doesn't really understand what's going on. And there's this detached community. It's this increasing gulf between the people who are engaged in this warfare on behalf of their country. First of all, it just would feel better to have a place where they could talk to each other and share this and share their critiques of the system to which they dedicated some of their lives, but also make that an opportunity to create a different kind of dialogue with people in the country who are interested in these issues. Is that fair?
It is. I wish I had said it myself. That was the perfect way of putting it.
You're coming up with, we're going to do some kind of publication that's going to have some kind of articles with this title. Talk to me a little bit then about the editorial decisions that you then have to make. What kind of articles, written by what kind of people? What's the way in which the fundamental editorial decisions you had to make in shaping a War on the Rocks?
It's about setting up a system with the right people, which I guess is like anything else. I went to friends of mine who had different involvement in national security. So we recruited the senior editors at the time. That was Jason Fritz, Stephen Tenkel, Mark Stout. And then, of course, there was John Amble, my partner in all this, who was critical in founding War on the Rocks and getting it started. John and I met in Helmand when he was an Army officer, and now he runs the Modern War Institute. Frank Hoffman was very involved from the beginning, T.X. Hammes. And then also my friend Lauren Katzenberg, who was our first assistant editor, alongside Usha Sahai, who I didn't know before, but who I met at the time. I tweeted out, we're looking to start something, and we got a coffee and have been friends and colleagues ever since. And now she's actually speechwriter for the Secretary of Defense. But you get together the right people, and you reach out to the kinds of people that you want to write. And I had that network just through these people that I'd been getting to know since I got back from Afghanistan. Friends, mentors, a lot of people from this listserv at the time called the Warlord Loop, at the time I was active on. And so it was about getting those people and a sort of high-low mix, big names, and then the people who are on the ground directly, to get people's attention and build an audience, but to deliver also an authenticity and as current information and analysis as possible on the pressing issues of the day.
Both of us probably get a lot of news digests, journals, there's a lot of stuff out there. You had to make some choices, like what kinds of articles? Are we just another or better version of Parameters? Are we, right? Or the Naval War College Review? Or is this more of an academic style? Or is it kind of chatty journalism? Is this like the cipher brief? Of course, this is all happening before there was such a thing as the cipher brief, which kind of was created to serve a slightly analogous set of people in the intel world.
Yeah, it was really about making an argument first and foremost. That's, I think, what's been the most common thing about War on the Rocks articles from the beginning, that for our main articles, it was about making an argument, presenting evidence, either by virtue of your own experience or, information that you've gathered and convincing. So it's not just about admiring the problem. It's not just about telling a story. It's about trying to contribute to change in policy, strategy, tactics, operations. From the beginning, that's been commonality. And I know it sounds sort of like an obvious thing, but to a lot of people and a lot of writers, it's actually not. To be given the freedom to make an argument, especially when you're in the military, is something that's very American. Other countries' militaries, even our closest democratic allies, don't really allow their service members to do that in the same way that we do. And so harnessing that energy, and no one had really asked these people what they thought before, certainly not for a public forum. And so it was just about harnessing this conversation that was already out there, tapping into it. I didn't create the conversation.
Well, what's been your experience with this issue of freedom to speak out? So you have these serving officers, many of them, who are making these arguments, sometimes challenging the brass. The First Amendment is not notoriously observed in all parts of the American military. It is a different kind of organization. And then there are also the informal and tacit worries about what this does to promotion or assignments. So now that you've had some experience with this, and your authors have had some experience with this, how's that freedom thing working out?
It's actually going pretty well. And it's really fundamentally, at the end of the day, just about exercising sound judgment and making sure that a service member has gone through whatever process they need to go through or don't need to go through on their end. I was just we're sitting here in Beaver Creek, Colorado at this conference. One of the attendees at this conference is an Air Force officer on the PACAF staff. Obviously, he wouldn't be and shouldn't be permitted to submit an article to War on the Rocks on what he's seeing about the development of Chinese military aviation tactics, for example, because he's working the problem. And he could only write an article based on informed, consciously or otherwise, classified information. So it's about being removed enough from the problem where you're not revealing something sensitive, tying things directly to your own experience and publicly available evidence as possible, and not trying to go necessarily beyond that. And then having those magic words at the end is these opinions do not represent those of name your service or the Defense Department or any part of the U.S. government. I mean, it's pretty amazing what kind of a shield that provides. We've really not only had maybe one or two issues where someone got into trouble, that I'm aware of at least, for something that they wrote in War on the Rocks. We do our best to protect them as well. We ask questions saying, are you sure you're able to say this? And can you cite something public on this? But it's really down to that person to make responsible decisions. And yeah, it's only happened once or twice in all these years. There's been a couple times where we've afforded someone the opportunity to use a pseudonym. And our standard for that is either it's something you should be able to say legally and ethically, but you're feeling pressured not to do it, and you would suffer career consequences for saying something that you actually should be able to say, which is a judgment call that we have to make as a editorial team. Aaron Stein is in charge of making these judgments now, our chief content officer. And then the other example is if you or your family may be harmed if you were to write this. And that's usually something that has only applied to people working abroad or who have family abroad. And again, I think we've only used pseudonyms 3 or 4 times in our entire history. So I think it's worked out pretty well. And what we would try to do is serve as an example for some of these other countries, these closely aligned democracies who don't have that culture. I think particularly of Britain and France. And they've made progress. We've partnered with this media organization in France called the Rubicon that's sort of modeled on War on the Rocks in some ways. And then, of course, there's the Wavell Room in the UK that's done some great stuff. But these institutions, these ministries of defense and the armed services over there are still not fully comfortable with it.
War on the Rocks was born digital, am I right?
Yeah.
And so you never really contemplated having a print version.
No, that only came later with the Texas National Security Review, of course, which we produced in partnership with the University of Texas. That has a print edition, but never even entertained the idea of a print edition for War on the Rocks.
Talk a little bit about how often you wanted to put something out. Very early on, you had to decide just at what speed are we going to set this treadmill?
Yeah, rather than a treadmill, and this is what I always say to editors we're bringing on, it's worse than a treadmill. You're at the beach and you think it's going to be a day at the beach, but you're actually laying on the sand just where the ocean hits the sand, and you're breathing through a straw, and the ocean just keeps coming and coming and coming. So being an editor is a grind, and you have to be the right kind of person to handle that. John and I did most of the editing for the first few years, so we know. And
again, that's John
Amble.
Yep.
And from the beginning, we set the pace of an article a day at least, ideally 2 articles most days, 5 days a week, not weekends. And we've stuck to that pretty well.
That's interesting, though. So daily, but only like 1 or 2 articles a day. We know of other pieces that try to crank out a much higher volume than that with trade-offs that they make. Is that related to the flow of submissions you're getting, or more a concern about your quality control?
Yeah, it's our staff capacity and quality control, which are closely related. We get way more submissions than we know what to do with. Most get rejected, but we get a lot of great submissions, and we could publish more, but we're limited by our, staff editorial resources and the need to make sure that everything has that sort of high quality, high credibility that people have come to expect from War on the Rocks, and they call us out for when they feel we haven't met that standard, which I think is great.
Some people listening to this may be thinking, well, maybe I want to contribute to War on the Rocks. So to that possible contributor, do you have any tips? Lots of tips. Know what you want to argue. Know what your argument is, and be able to say it in 2 concise sentences. And send us a pitch to editor@warontherocks.com, and Aaron and Nick and our other teammates will take it from there. We have a great submissions page at warontherocks.com /submissions that answers every manner of questions that you might have. But we pick, I think what makes us different from other publications is we accept an article based on the writer and who that person is as much as what they have to say, which is not to say you have to be a famous person or a big name or done all these things or deployed 12 times. But you have to have some sort of experience that gives you what I call special knowledge about the topic that you're writing about, something that you know that other people don't know about something that's important to national strategy or international strategy. So let me talk to you a little bit about how the conversation among the community has changed. In 2013, and we talked about this, a lot of this is coming out of the frustration and bitterness in the small wars world, so to speak, in the Afghanistan and Iraq experiences and a lot of the related things. That's 2013. It turns out that period is almost the eve of the transition then to a whole additional raft of different kinds of security problems. So you start out with trying to give voice to one kind of community that's worrying about one kind, a set of things. But then as you're going along, the conversation changes. Talk a little bit about just your experience now over the 10 years of how that conversation has changed, how the community has changed.
There was a lot of focus on counterinsurgency and special operations in that first year. But even from the beginning, there was a strong interest, and this has been a thread throughout, in naval affairs. In 2013, as you might remember, air-sea battle, which I still don't think we ever figured out what it was, despite all the articles on it, was a big topic. But I think the thing that has surprised me the most, of course, our content has mapped along with this shift towards great power competitors with Russia and China. Nuclear issues have always been a major thread from the beginning, and that's never changed. But some of the things that really surprised me at the time that became really important issues, starting fairly early on, I'd say maybe 2014, 2015, was military personnel issues. Articles on military personnel end up being among the most read on our site. And it makes sense when you step back, because this is something that affects people's lives, also affects the composition of our armed forces and how leaders are selected, and which at the end of the day affects our fortunes in peace and war. But at the time, it wasn't immediately obvious to me that this would be an important part of what we do, and it's ended up being one of the most important parts of what we do.
So say some more about how the conversation has changed, whether you think people are as disillusioned as they were 10 years ago, more disillusioned, more hopeful, less hopeful about the way the system is evolving, charged up, depressed. I mean, is that just more or less constant? Because these are people who are making arguments about the system they're in, and in a way, I'm trying to get a sense of how feelings about that system have changed and evolved.
I think this maps onto society as a whole, but there's just been a lot more disillusionment and I'd say cynicism. I'd say since the Trump years, but that's persisted through the Biden years. And this is a judgment I make not just on what we publish, but what the submissions that we see, also the discussions that happen in the War Hall, which is our members-only forum. The manner of our exit from Afghanistan was a big blow to our community, many of whom spent big parts of their lives there, lost a lot of friends there. And so the way in which that happened, which I think was pretty shameful, even though I was for a withdrawal, was a big blow and sort of fed into a lot of that cynicism and disillusionment. Yet at the same time, what's been special about our community is more than most segments of society we've stayed more inured from the partisan division. So of course we have Republican readers and Democrat readers. We actually survey on this, and they're about equally split. But we get very high marks on not being seen as favorable towards one party or another, even though we've been quite critical of presidents, including Trump, of course, but also Biden. But we've stayed apart. I think our readers as a group have stayed apart from a lot of that bitter partisan division and this tendency to get lost in the culture wars where no one really wins.
You mentioned the military personnel issues, which are growing from what I can tell, because maybe partly because of the recruitment issues, too, and some of the issues in retention of promising junior officers. Do you see areas where you think you're pleased and impressed by changes you've seen? Here are all these people making arguments, railing at the machine sometimes, more constructive, ordinary arguments. And so it would be just kind of interesting to sense over time, is some of this ferment having an impact? And do you kind of see some places where, there's movement, there's promise?
There is. Although I have more to say on the subject of impact, which is elusive. But where we have had impact, I think, is, we published these articles by, at the time, it was someone writing under a pseudonym, Ned Stark, who was a colonel in the Air Force. He since revealed himself, Jason Lamb, when the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, Dave Goldfein, actually was very receptive to what he was saying and offered him a job. But Jason was very critical.
The general was looking around and said, where do I find this Colonel Stark? Wasn't he beheaded in an episode of Game of Thrones?
Exactly.
So you look at it and say, is there a Colonel Stark who wants to be promoted? Raise your hand.
It wasn't quite so cynical. And Jason actually ended up leaving the Air Force as a colonel but he did think he might be beheaded, which is why he chose that name. And that started a broader conversation that did lead to quite a lot of changes in Air Force personnel systems. I'm not going to say that was the only cause, but I think it was a really important contributing factor to making that conversation more urgent and the reforms that came more of a higher priority than they might have been otherwise. Another example, and this is bigger than personnel, but it includes personnel, is all the changes we've seen in the Marine Corps over the last several years, which have been remarkable. And credit goes not just to General David Berger, who just relinquished command recently, but to lots of field grade and even below officers who drove this process of creativity, experimentation, questioning everything, to the composition of different units, to the qualifications that infantrymen should have. And actually, a lot of this came out of Secretary Mattis's Close Combat Lethality Task Force as well. There were a lot of fathers of this victory, and included a lot of personnel reforms in the Marine Corps that I think are remarkable. And War in the Rocks ended up being the form of choice for these internal debates and discussions about what the Marine Corps of the future should be, including on personnel issues. But, impact, as we've discussed before, is a tough thing. I think some days the best we can do is give people a sharper lens through which to see a problem and hope that it contributes to some positive change. And most of the times it won't. And even when it will, I often won't be able to see it. Or I might find out years later, and this happens. This article started this conversation that led to this change. But it's still a hard thing to do. And it's one of the frustrating things. I started War in the Rocks to stoke and provoke a better strategic conversation, and you might hope that would lead to better strategic outcomes, which I would argue it hasn't for our country. But
has not.
Maybe that's too. No, I don't think it has. I think we're still mired in a lot of the same strategic atrophy that we have been since I was in Afghanistan over 10 years ago. But I hope we're helping. I'm not always sure we are. I think at its best, War in the Rocks, in our podcasts, and of course TNSR as well, is part of an engine for discovery. Discovering the true nature of problems and what can be done to solve them. And as long as we're doing that, then we're doing something important. But, I have this problem where I always expect things to happen faster and better. And so maybe that leads to unrealistic expectations sometimes.
Well, sometimes things don't happen at the speed of light, but they happen at the speed of life.
Yes.
So
that's right.
Congratulations on the first 10 years. You've gotten things on an important trajectory, and I think all of the listeners are going to agree with me that we hope you'll keep the conversation going.
We certainly will. And the next phase is really about institutionalization. It's about finding a future for this company, this project, which wasn't started as a company. I didn't start it as a commercial project. It sort of became one when it just started growing much faster than I expected, and we had to find ways of growing and paying people, which took quite a few years to figure out. It took, I think, 3 or 4 years to figure that out. But the next stage in War in the Rocks is institutionalizing and finding a future for War in the Rocks that doesn't necessarily involve me, which isn't to say I'm leaving anytime soon. But we are actively planning the future where War in the Rocks is run by people like Aaron Stein, who's been with us for a year now and has been already done transformative work. All the work that you've seen, the changes to our membership program, the expansion of what that does have been driven by Aaron and actually Aaron O'Brien, Aaron with an E, who's our membership editor as well, and other members of staff like Nick Danforth. So that's really the next challenge, is to take something that was started by a person and mostly run by a person, where I've been, frankly, the single point of failure on lots of things, and grow it into something bigger that lasts beyond me without losing that vision.
No, you're trying to institutionalize the community and institutionalize the conversation. In a way, it's a healthy, self-critical mechanism for one of the most important parts of what our country does. We don't have actually a lot of really healthy, self-critical mechanisms of this kind. So it would be nice if we could institutionalize it and let it be around for a while.
Yeah.
We're going through a period of really remarkable historic change. This is an extraordinary period of history, and entities like War on the Rocks are more necessary perhaps than they were when they were created.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. And thanks for doing this. Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Stay safe and stay healthy. And thank you for being a part of our tribe.